namely with special forces.
But this is about sending a political signal from NATO, isn't it? And the European Union and the United Nations all at one in 24 hours.
Yes, it sounds tremendous at the moment, but remember when we've had these debates before, France, for one, has said, oh yes, we'll do anything provided it's got a UN mandate. So it goes back up the tubes, comes right down through the system, and now they want to bring the EU into it. They've got momentum at the moment. I'm sorry to be a touch cynical. I wonder if they're going to keep it going to this time next week.
Kevin O'Brien, Article 5 being invoked, we believe, at this moment. An extraordinary moment politically and diplomatically because of the speed and the determination among the 19.
Absolutely. I think the last country in the now 19-nation alliance in NATO that anybody expected to be the first country within NATO to be attacked, thus invoking Article 5, would have been the United States. The speed with which this has changed things is largely due to the fact that I think the shock value of that attack has pushed things forward. I do think that there will be some rethinking of things over the next couple of days within a few of the member states, but I think largely that this is the basis for the existence of NATO. NATO must act on Article 5, otherwise it has no reason for existence.
And does this mean military mobilization or merely the other assets, the platforms up there, the intelligence things that you know all about?
Article 5 doesn't specify what exactly must be mobilized, but within the NATO Charter is the implicit understanding that all military and related assets within any NATO member country can and should be shared with all other members in order to support Article 5. So I think it won't just be military action. Some countries, such as Germany, probably will not become involved in military action, but will provide other types of support. Obviously, some key members, especially Britain, will share intelligence with the United States.
Kevin and Robert from the moment, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's the political and diplomatic side of things, but there remain terrifying stories of human courage and terrible personal loss. They are now coming in within hours of yesterday's attacks. Passengers on hijacked planes, people buried alive in the rubble at the Pentagon and in New York, and countless stories of bravery by emergency workers. These are some of the firefighters drafted into New York after so many of their colleagues, we believe up to 300, were killed.
With dawn, some measure of the damage. Fine silt and twisted metal, all that remains of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, the workplace of 50,000 people, until 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. No one knows how many actually died, only that hundreds perished because they went to rescue the injured and got caught in the aftermath. This is Engine Company 30, where every fireman died. Another team of fire crews is moving in to take the place of their dead comrades.
People are feeling like they lost their family, because everybody knows somebody that's been here, been at the fire and died. Brothers, friends, relatives, and it's the worst day the fire department has ever had.
Why are people moving here? Why is this fire department moved here particularly?
Because the companies that are here lost all their members in the engine and truck company.
And a city fearing the worst. A hushed New York with little moving apart from ambulances and police, and increasingly the occasional hearse. Doctors have not been working flat out, simply because the injured remained where they died.
St. Vincent's Hospital is the closest trauma center to the World Trade Center. We were told to expect about 1,000 patients. Unfortunately, because of the nature of this tragedy, we only received 365. Many thousands of people have perished in this.
And they should not expect to be called for a couple of days, but to please fill this out only, and then we will be calling them.
But a city queues to give blood. Blood donation centers have been crowded. Lines of determined people, angry people.
And I'm here because I love freedom and humanity. So help me. Just like Pearl Harbor, there will be no compromise. This will not ever happen again.
Amid the unfolding personal tragedies, people here also feel outrage at an attack on a city they love.
In that gap was the very symbol of New York. Those two twin towers that were on T-shirts, the logo of this city, now not there, just a gap. Stephen Evans, BBC News, New York.
Well, let's now look at some of the investigation which has been going on. According to the FBI, they've received 700 tips from a special website which they set up. One of them included details which have led to at least 2 of the suspected hijackers who took pilot training in Venice in Florida. The FBI have tracked down where they lived and stayed, and also a 1989 red Pontiac. At the same time, news was coming in of a raid on the Boston Hotel, the Westin Hotel in the Back Bay area in Copley Square in Boston. Boston was the airport from which 2 of the 4 hijacked aircraft flew yesterday. And during the drama there, I spoke to our correspondent in Boston, Jonathan Dyer.
Armed police with shields and bulletproof vests, helmets and what appeared to be door rams and machine guns entered the Westin Hotel in downtown Boston. The Westin Hotel is on Copley Square, which is probably the main tourist district of Boston. They entered the hotel and we believed carried out some kind of operation on the 16th floor.
And at that point, we go to the State Department briefing room for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was in Peru when the incidents took place.
Several hours since I spoke to the press this morning. Let me begin once again by saying that our hearts go out to all the victims and to their families. It is a tragedy, but as the President has made clear, it is a tragedy that we are strong enough to overcome. Our spirits will not be broken. The resilience of this society will not be broken. We will find out who is responsible for this, and they will pay for it. We are undertaking a full-court press diplomatically, politically, militarily, and in the course of the morning and early afternoon, I have been in touch with a number of foreign leaders and international organizational leaders to coordinate the diplomatic approach to this. I have talked to Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, and I thank the United Nations for the Security Council resolution they passed, and also for the statement from the General Assembly, and I expect the General Assembly to also work on a resolution later today. Lord Robertson in NATO is hard at work with a resolution that is under consideration now that would tee up, if I can put it that way, prime Article 5 responsibilities. Article 5 of the Charter says that an attack from abroad by any one against any member of the alliance is an attack against the alliance. If that resolution goes forward, that doesn't invoke Article 5 yet, but it puts in a position to be invoked when the United States makes a judgment about the nature of the attack and where that attack came from. And I appreciate what Lord Robertson and his colleagues are doing for us. I've also been in touch with Foreign Minister of Belgium, Louis Michel, who is also head of the presidency of the EU at this time, and High Representative Javier Solana, to thank them for the strong support we have received from the European Union and the statements they have made and their cooperation promised to us to deal with this tragedy and to move forward. I've also attended, along, of course, with my other colleagues, a National Security Council meeting with the President where we reviewed all that has happened and began to make our plans for the efforts we will be taking in the future, not only to bring these perpetrators to not only justice but to the punishment they deserve, but at the same time to undertake a worldwide effort to build a coalition against all forms of terrorism, wherever it may occur and however it rears its ugly head. This will be a major priority of the administration, and I can assure you it will therefore be a major priority of the State Department. I have also, in the course of the day, spoken to the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, Germany, Canada. I have spoken to Foreign Minister Perez twice, Prime Minister Sharon, Chairman Arafat, and Foreign Minister Manley of Canada, if I didn't mention that, Foreign Minister Ivanov of Russia, Foreign Minister Ruggiero of Italy, and I have another number of other calls that are in the process of being made so that we can bring all of this together. And I must say I am deeply touched by the expressions of support I have received from my colleagues. And as I think you all know, the President has been very busy, and I'm sure the White House has announced his 2 phone calls to President Putin as well as to Mr. Chirac, Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, Prime Minister Blair, Chancellor Schroeder, and Prime Minister Chrétien. So he's spoken to all four members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, and I will leave it to my other cabinet colleagues to talk about the issues under their purview over at Defense, Justice, and FBI. There are, of course, lots of reports and rumors out there, and I think it is wise for all of us to take many of these reports and rumors into some context and perspective. This is also a time, of course, in that regard, for the American people to try, in this time of tragedy, to restore the society to a sense of normalcy. We've got to get back to our jobs. We've got to get back to work. And I know that Secretary Mineta, as soon as it is possible and as soon as it makes sense and is safe, will restore the air traffic system, and commercial air traffic will be brought back online, and I will wait for him to make those announcements with respect to that, and I know that's very much on your mind. Once again, we're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end. I will be delighted to take a few questions.
Secretary, the State Department has been advocating restraint in response to terrorism with the argument that violence only provokes more violence. It's an endless cycle. I wondered if the U.S. will be guided by its own admonition now that the U.S. has been horribly attacked by terrorists.
I think when you are attacked by a terrorist and you know who the terrorist is and you can fingerprint back to the cause of the terror, you should respond.
But
Andrew?
I mean, should it be a limited response, or?
You should respond, whether it's limited or other than limited. You should respond to those who did it, and if you're able to stop terrorist attacks, you should stop terrorist attacks. Andrea?
Secretary Powell, one country you didn't mention was Pakistan, and I understand that your deputy has spoken with the ambassador to Pakistan, and that this evening the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan will be meeting with General Musharraf. What specific steps are you asking Pakistan to take, and have you at all insinuated that if all signs do lead to bin Laden, that the U.S. would take military action against Pakistan and Afghanistan?
Our ambassador is going to be seeing going to be having that meeting that you made reference to. It'll probably not be this evening, more likely tomorrow as a result of schedule problems. But Ambassador Armitage, Deputy Secretary Armitage, did meet with Pakistani officials today, and really to share views. We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack. But we thought, as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information, and to see if they can be helpful in generating information, as well as how helpful they might be if we find a basis to act upon that information. So yes, we are doing what you described with the Pakistanis. Robert?
Just to clarify, when you say you're building a strong coalition to go after the perpetrators, does this mean that you are expecting or hoping that other countries will participate in some kind of military retaliation?
Under Article 5, if we go that far and it actually is executed, then there is an obligation on the part of our NATO allies to assist if we go in this direction. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will participate in the attack, but it makes it easier to obtain support in the way of overflight rights and things of that nature. So but I don't want to get into what we might or might not do and who might go with us and who might not go with us, because that's just too speculative at the moment.
Can I follow that? Having been through the Gulf War as you were, would you hope to build a kind of coalition that extends perhaps beyond NATO and includes perhaps Muslim nations from different parts of the world?
It should include Muslim nations. Muslim nations have just as much to fear from terrorism that strikes at innocent civilians. And I do have a number of calls, and I just haven't connected yet with other leaders in the world representing Muslim populations As I was coming down, I was waiting to receive a call from Amr Moussa, head of the Arab League, and I'll also be talking to my Egyptian colleagues and Jordanian colleagues before the evening is out. Yes, sir.
You have not yet mentioned the point that President Bush made last night, the idea of holding other countries responsible.
Yeah.
This seems to be a dramatic escalation in the U.S. view on how it responds to terrorism. Is that a correct interpretation of it? And as a follow-up, you talk about returning to normal, yet there have been all these mentions of acts of war, and the idea that the country is in a war. How can we just return to normal when in a situation like this?
Well, on your first point, I mentioned in my earlier statements, and I will mention it again, that it's not just a matter of going after the perpetrators, but it's going after and dealing with the sources of support that they have, whether that source of support might come from a host country or other organizations that provide them. We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get it by its branch and root. And so we will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups. Now, yes, we believe that acts of war have been committed against the American people, and we will respond accordingly. But at the same time, life has to go on. In all of the difficult times we will be facing ahead, we have to still try to return life to a sense of normalcy. We cannot be a people who are afraid to live. We cannot be a people who will move away from a relatively open society. We cannot be a people who walk around terrified. We're Americans. We don't walk around terrified. We're going to be strong in this difficult period, and we're going to move forward with pride and with determination, and we will get our society back to normal with whatever additional precautions nevertheless might be necessary to secure our society without locking ourselves down. Yes, sir.
Secretary Powell, yesterday Senator Graham said that in response to the attacks he would be willing to reassess the ban on assassinations of foreign leaders. And I was wondering, would you support such a reassessment?
The ban is an executive order, and we have not made such a reassessment, and I'll just leave it there. Jane?
India has said many times in the past that Pakistan is harboring terrorism and there are training camps in Pakistan, and now U.S. officials, including a number of lawmakers here on the Hill, are saying that Osman bin Laden have his training camps in Pakistan, and because he's sending all his, running his empire or terrorism empire from Pakistan. So now, is it time now to go after those countries who are harboring terrorism, really? Because how long can we wait, or how many innocent people can we kill?
Well, I don't want to confirm what the Indian government may or may not have said. But as the President said last night, we will be directing our efforts not only against terrorists, but against those who do harbor and do provide haven and do provide support for terrorism. Jane?
Deputy Secretary Armitage heads a task force with the Russians on Afghanistan, where the United States and Russia seem to share some interest. Can this be used as a platform in the coming days?
Yes, and we're planning to do that.
In what way?
As you know, it's a little difficult to travel right now, but we're looking at ways that he and Deputy Foreign Minister Trubnikov can pursue this.
With a country like Afghanistan, with whom we don't have diplomatic relations, there's less leverage that we have against that country. What kind of things are you thinking of using now when you talk about going after the entire country? Is it food aid? How else
we
can you
haven't
push the
singled
Taliban?
out any country to go after. What we're trying to do now is gather the evidence and the information so that we can make a judgment as to who is responsible for this act. And once we do that, we will go after that group, and we will determine what kinds of support they've been getting from what host countries or other supporting agencies, and we will go and deal with them as well.
Mr. Secretary, there are some 25 organizations on the list of FTOs, the State Department's list. Should all those organizations consider themselves targets of this global campaign against terrorism? And secondly, when you speak to the Arab leaders, and will you be asking for specific acts of support, of material assistance in this campaign?
On the first question, just the very designation that they have been put on that list of foreign terrorist organizations suggests that the United States will be taking action against them, and we just identified another one this week, the AUC in Colombia, and we take certain actions against them. It doesn't mean we go in and attack them with military force, but there are a variety of political and diplomatic and other and legal actions that you can take against them. With respect to conversations with Arab leaders, I'm sure I will discuss with them a full range of possibilities as to what kind of support they can give us of a political and diplomatic nature. I don't know of any other kind of support that I would ask for at this time. I might mention that in the context of my discussions this morning with Shimon Peres and Chairman Arafat and also Prime Minister Sharon, I encouraged all sides to do everything they can to get this process of meetings started that we have all been waiting for Mr. Arafat and Mr. Peres to find an opportunity in the very near future to meet and not have protracted discussions about where to meet. It's more important to meet. So in this time of tragedy, in this time of heightened tension throughout the world and especially throughout that region, let's seize this opportunity to see if we can not start this process of meetings, the schedule of meetings, so that we can get to the Mitchell Peace Plan. So even while we are dealing with this situation, this crisis that is here in Washington and New York, we are also working on the Middle East situation and seeing if we can get that jump started. Yes.
Do you believe that this attack is linked to the events in the Middle East, to the Arab-Israel crisis, or is this something that preceded this current intifada? And secondly, do you believe that this bombing will somehow serve as a problem for moderate Arab governments whose peoples seem to be more enthusiastic about this bombing than their governments who have condemned it?
The governments have condemned it. I think that when it is realized throughout the region what a horrible act this truly was, I think it'll be sobering for the region. And I hope everybody will realize that no matter what you might think about the crisis in the Middle East, this is not the way to solve it. And this is not the way to express your views about that by killing hundreds and thousands of innocent civilians. I hope that is sobering to anybody who has any civilized drop of blood flowing through their body and who believe in an almighty of some form or another. This is not the way you do it. There's no religion that would condone the kinds of action that we are seeing. And so I hope this will be a sobering experience for the world, and especially for those in the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf. Yes, Steve. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, we know you have said that you don't know who's responsible, but your comments this morning on television and the President's comments about harboring terrorists do seem to indicate an organization such as Osama bin Laden, and also about harboring terrorism point to Afghanistan as a country that harbors terrorists. What did you make of the comments by the Supreme Leader of the Taliban yesterday about the attack? And do you think that that the Taliban are still harboring Osama bin Laden? And if he is deemed responsible for this attack, do you think that the Taliban will expel Osama bin Laden and help the U.S. bring him to justice?
I'm sure that the Taliban leadership providing protection and opportunities and facilities for Osama bin Laden. But I don't want to get into the hypotheticals as to whether or not he is responsible for it. A body of evidence is being developed, and in due course we'll make an announcement, but I don't think it's useful to say, well, we're 50%, 60%, 70% sure it's this organization or that. That just leads to very often incorrect answers, and I don't think it's helpful during this time. So as the evidence builds, and it is building, in due course we will make a judgment, and we will act upon that judgment in the way the President has indicated.
The last one for Alan. Mr.
Alan?
Secretary, what conversations do you anticipate having with the leaders of Persian Gulf countries? What support will you be seeking from them if, in fact, it's found that the threat originated in their part of the world? And what kind of military latitude would you like to be able to exercise in that part of the world that they're blessing?
If we think they can be helpful in finding those who may be responsible, we will expect that help. And we will express the point of view very, very clearly, and I've already started to do so in some of my preliminary conversations, and frankly, I expect support. They are outraged, they are shocked, they are stunned, whatever their views might be, or whatever the views of their people might be with respect to the crisis in the Middle East. They are stunned and find this to be a deplorable act. I think they are speaking not just as leaders, but as leaders of people who, although some might rejoice and shout, most find this to be deplorable and something to be condemned. And going back to an earlier question, obviously the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis has been going on for a long time and is always in the background, but some of the terrorist organizations that we have seen at work over the years conduct terrorist activities against the United States, regardless of how the peace process may or may not be going with respect to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you very much. Thank you.
U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell underlining that there is now a worldwide coalition building against terrorism, reflecting very much the mood at NATO among the 19 nations. He is just making a final remark.
I'll be doing more this afternoon. We're still changing time zones.
Okay, no, he's just talking about his schedule, I think. He said that we, the American people, we cannot be a people who are afraid to live and live terrified. And he said that he's getting enormous support from other countries. No religion, said the U.S. Secretary of State, could condone the actions that we have seen. Colin Powell is still speaking, I think.
I really need to yield that part of it to intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Thank you. I don't.
And that's... he has just confirmed, I was just listening and picking up that he has confirmed what we'd heard a few minutes ago, that Ari Fleischer, the spokesman at the White House for the President, had confirmed that the plane which went into the Pentagon yesterday, in the view of all those who've analyzed what happened, was in fact being targeted on the White House. That there confirmed from the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Now let's move on, and for some reaction on that, I'm joined now by Martin Indyk from our Washington studio. He's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and was formerly ambassador to Israel, but he was also on the National Security Council, a special presidential advisor on Arab-Israeli issues, Iraq, Iran and South Asia. Martin Indyk, welcome to BBC World. Baghdad, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein said today that the United States is reaping the thorns of its foreign policy. How much does that reflect a much more universal view across the Arab world, in your estimation?
Oh, I don't think that Saddam Hussein should be taken as representative of anybody but Saddam Hussein, not even of the Iraqi people whom he oppresses. And this is typical of his anti-Americanism. But I do not believe that that's representative of the views of the leaders of the Arab world who have spoken out against this, and the Secretary of State referred to that kind of overwhelming response he'd received of condemnation from the leaders of the Arab world.
Well, let me be more specific then. Who in the Arab world is reflected in that kind of spirit which we've heard from Saddam Hussein? How much of a small minority is it?
Look, there's anger at the United States in the Arab world. There's been anger for a long time at the United States. Some of that is exploited by extremist organizations like Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda and the Jamaat Islamiyah, and some of it's exploited by, he tries to exploit it in the case of Saddam Hussein. But I think that what has happened here is so devastating, so horrendous in its proportions. It is such an act of war and will be treated as such by the United States that what we're talking about here is a paradigm shift in all of the kind of Arabist notions that we've dealt with before, that the Arab street is seething and somehow we have conducted some original sin by supporting Israel is really something that we should put aside in these circumstances and recognize that something very dramatic has happened here, horrific and tragic, and requires an overwhelming response from all civilized people, including in the Arab world.
Do you believe that many nations in the Arab world, and we have to assume that it is the Arab world, judging by what we keep hearing, and it is only an assumption, do you believe that there are nations, if the group who did this are identified, would yield up, would offer to America, whoever did it, in order to escape retribution?
No, I think that only when they see that they're faced with an overwhelming coalition of nations determined to support the United States in taking forceful measures against them, is there a possibility that they would decide to stop providing safe haven to terrorist organizations. But it's going to require that kind of concerted response. It's going to require the threat of certain action by the United States that will have the support of the civilized world that now has the prospect of getting them to change their attitude towards support for terrorism.
Martin Indyk from the Brookings Institution, thanks for joining us live from Washington. Well, we close this segment of our programming with news that heavily armed FBI agents have entered a hotel in Boston as part of an investigation apparently linked to the attacks on New York and Washington. President George W. Bush has talked about acts of war, and we've just heard the Secretary of State Colin Powell say that a worldwide coalition against terrorism is building. Here are the harrowing images of the last day and a half. Stay tuned to BBC World.
This is a war. It's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
President Bush says the attacks on America were acts of war. The search for suspects begins. FBI agents and police storm a hotel in Boston. NATO considers enabling an armed response to the attack by all its members. Another day of smoke and debris in Manhattan. The mayor says thousands are believed dead. It's reported that the plane that hit the Pentagon was heading for the White House. Watching BBC World News, I'm Philip Hayton. President Bush has described the attacks on New York and Washington as an act of war against the United States. He said America was facing a new and different kind of enemy, but that good would prevail over evil. His Secretary of State, Colin Powell, says that the United States hopes to build a worldwide coalition against terror. America's European allies have issued statements affirming their support. NATO is now considering its response. It's expected to invoke part of its founding treaty. Article 5 says that an attack on one member country would trigger collective armed action by all. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation into who was responsible for the attacks has been gathering pace. In Boston, the departure point of the hijacked planes, heavily armed police have stormed a hotel in the center of the city.
A blood-red sun hung over New York at dawn on the day after the disaster, the smoke as from a battlefield. If they thought they'd been asleep and dreaming, they could not have been more wrong. The nightmare did not stop with the new day. And after the fixed camera shots of yesterday have come new pictures from cameramen who were close to the attack.
And I just remember thinking that after a couple of seconds, this is coming at me.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to get out of the way. So I just turned the camera over my shoulder, pointed it up in the air, and just started running. And I've seen footage of volcano ash chasing down a village, and just knew that I was going to be in a really nasty situation. And I just dove under the biggest emergency response vehicle that I could see.
But this was no volcano, it was a man-made disaster, and the dust and smoke billowed through the amazing glass canyons of New York. And then, as night fell, they worked on and on, putting out the fires, worrying about the safety of surrounding buildings and looking for survivors, knowing that maybe 300 firefighters had been in the Twin Towers when they collapsed, among thousands of other people.
Boom, hit with all the dust, and it was black. I mean, pitch black. I don't know anybody could have survived being on the street at that time.
Personal possessions were tossed aside. What happened to the girl whose doll now lies among the debris? No one will hazard a guess as to the number of dead. Thousands died, certainly. The mayor of New York said it'll be a figure too hard to bear.
I just wanted to make sure that everything is here that could be here, and it is, so we just pray to God that we can save a few people.
In this most community-spirited of nations, people lined up to give blood.
Everything we can do to help at this time is important, so this is just a small sacrifice compared to the suffering that's going on.
And there's been potentially an early breakthrough in the criminal investigation. A hire car has been seized in Massachusetts with an Arabic-language flight manual on the back seat. The FBI also found a videotape on how to fly airliners and a copy of the Quran. Even the seats where 5 Arab men are supposed to have sat down in the airport were taken away for forensic tests. The only planes in the air over America in the last 24 hours have been the Air Force, including Air Force One, the jumbo jet which carries the president, and the fighter jets escorting it. Now the president is back in Washington, rallying world opinion for action against America's enemy.
This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever. This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever. This enemy attacked not just our people, but all freedom-loving people everywhere in the world.
And the first casualties of what the president said was an act of war have now been laid out, while the work goes on to treat the injured and seek any more survivors. To say that the emergency services were overstretched is an understatement, and all this in a city where normal communications were fractured. This morning, rescue workers were given new impetus when 6 firefighters were found alive in a space under the rubble.
Now, why is it that do you believe that they were able to survive such a horrendous accident?
Well, they were fortunate enough to fall into a void. When the building fell, there must have been a part of the structure that kind of surrounded them and protected them from the falling debris. So when the debris fell on the side, they were in an air pocket. And they just stayed there until help arrived, because there's a lot of voids down there. The building, the first few floors is kind of still intact. So I'm hoping that most people undergrade, there might be a lot of voids, but unfortunately most people that were above the first few floors, very little hope as far as I know.
So let's go find him. Come on.
Brenda Schonholt set out with her daughters to look for her husband, who worked in the World Trade Center. She had heard no news of him since the attack. They were stopped at a police line.
We're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father, who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife was in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife.
It was the story of New York, but with cell phones working again, they had a glimmer of hope. And then, unbelievably, they found him.
One little happy ending on a day with so much anguish and so much...
In Washington, congressmen gathering to return to their offices burst into spontaneous patriotic song. But America will take more than a song before it's healed.
God bless America.
David Loyne, BBC News.
A few minutes ago, the American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, gave a news conference at the State Department. He said a major priority of the Bush administration would be to build a worldwide coalition against all forms of terrorism. He told reporters that the NATO treaty raises the possibility of joint action in response to an attack.
Under Article 5, if we go that far and it actually is executed, then there is an obligation on the part of our NATO allies to assist if we go in this direction. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will participate in the attack, but it makes it easier to obtain support in the way of overflight rights and things of that nature. So but I don't want to get into what we might or might not do and who might go with us and who might not go with us, because that's just too speculative at the moment.
Can I follow that? Having been through the Gulf War as you were, would you hope to build a kind of coalition that extends perhaps beyond NATO and includes perhaps Muslim nations from different parts of the world?
It should include Muslim nations. Muslim nations have just as much to fear from terrorism that strikes at innocent civilians. And I do have a number of calls, and I just haven't connected yet with other leaders in the world representing Muslim populations. As I was coming down, I was waiting to